There were none that could be seen. There was nothing behind the border that could have supported that kind of number of troops and tanks.
We've obtained copies of those Soviet satellite photos from September 1990. With powerful magnification, the photographs are detailed enough for experts to identify vehicles around the Kuwaiti oil fields. But in southern Kuwait, along the Saudi border, there are no Iraqi tanks to be seen whatsoever, let alone 1,500 of them. Just sand and wind. Not a sign of what Defense Secretary Cheney insisted were 250,000 Iraqi troops.
It became a critical issue because it was the administration convinced the Saudis they were in imminent danger and got the Saudis to invite the coalition to come in and defend them. And that's how we got involved in Gulf War I.
Coincidentally, Jean Heller is also from Wyoming. As a journalist there, she had dealt with Dick Cheney for years. So she presented her evidence directly to his office at the Pentagon.
I said, look, if you can prove to me that our story isn't true, we won't run it. And they just ignored us.
When Kuwait was liberated, the issue disappeared. As for Cheney's top-secret satellite images,
they have never showed those photos. Not then and not since. Not to this day.
More than a decade later, men named Cheney and Bush would again lead a rush to attack Saddam Hussein, predicting impending doom, with little to prove it. And as you'll see when we come back, between his wars with Iraq, Dick Cheney would make himself a very rich man, doing business not only with the U.S. government, but also with its enemies.
He says that he wasn't aware that Halliburton was doing business with Iraq while he was the CEO there. If you believe that, then he's either a very, very bad CEO for not being aware of something like that, or he's not telling the truth.
It was 1991. The first Gulf War was over, and communism was collapsing. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney set out to downsize the U.S. military. He hired a private company to help him do it. They came up with a plan and a recommendation for who best could implement it, themselves. Theirs is now a household name, Halliburton. That connection would start paying off 3 years later when Bill Clinton took over the White House and Dick Cheney found himself out of a job. With time on his hands, he and some business friends came to the Miramichi River in New Brunswick to catch salmon. The story goes that Cheney was taking a nap when talk turned to a company looking for a new chief executive. It was a big name in the oil services business and at the Pentagon, Halliburton. The consensus? Why not Dick?
Since he wasn't there to object, sure enough, a few weeks later, he was named the CEO and chairman of Halliburton.
Business reporter Dan Briotti is the author of a recent history of Halliburton. He says the choice of Cheney, a consummate government insider, was no accident.
If you're in Halliburton's position, you have a history, an 80-year history of using politicians or ex-politicians to do your bidding for you in Washington, D.C.
Halliburton's role model was former President Lyndon Johnson. He had helped Halliburton get work in Washington. They had helped him to the White House.
Dick Cheney is simply the latest in a succession of politicians that Halliburton has used to score government contracts.
When Cheney took over Halliburton, a Canadian named Abdul-Amir Mahdi was in the oil business too. Born in Iraq, he'd come to Canada in his 20s and was the father of 4. He had built a successful business supplying oil fields in Iran with North American parts, often purchased from Halliburton.
You'd done business with them before. You were registered in their system. You had a customer number. They knew
the market we serve.
They knew what you wanted and where it went.
That's exactly, yes.
But the U.S. was getting tougher with states sponsoring terrorism, like Iran, Iraq, and Libya, and clamping down on Americans doing business with them. When the U.S. passed that embargo prohibiting trade with Iran in the mid-90s, Abdul Mahdi says he sought legal advice as to how it might affect a Canadian. He says he went to Canada Customs and to a Toronto law firm, and that he was told, you're not American, you're based in Canada. The ban doesn't apply to you. Mahdi didn't know it yet, but south of the border, American law enforcement had other ideas. He wasn't American, he wasn't in the U.S., but that didn't discourage the U.S. federal agents who were keeping an eye on him.
Subsequently, we determined that most of the equipment, the orders that actually went, were going to Iran.
Lyndon Berezowski was the U.S. export enforcement agent who supervised the case against Mahdi.
Once these acts became illegal, and he knew it was illegal to do it, he then continued to do it.
But it wasn't illegal for him to do it in Canada, which is where he was doing it.
No, but it was illegal for him to violate U.S. law, and what he was charged with was violating U.S. law.
Illegal or not, American agents lured Mahdi onto U.S. soil by convincing a supplier to invite him to a meeting in Florida.
When did you realize that you were in big trouble?
When they handcuffed me in Florida.
Mahdi was arrested. He pled guilty to evading U.S. export controls and spent almost 4 years in prison. The question he asks now is, if he was guilty of breaking the law, why was it Halliburton, the company whose parts he had sold to Iran for years?
Would it not stand to reason that after the embargo got put in place, when you came to them looking for parts, that's where those parts would go? Would they not know that?
Well, it doesn't take a bright man to figure this out. We only sell Halliburton to Iran. We never sold Halliburton to anybody but Iran.
So you'd think investigators would have tried to establish exactly what Halliburton's role was. Specifically, if Dick Cheney's company knew its parts were going to Iran. Not according to Mahdi.
In all of this, did anyone ever mention Halliburton?
Never.
Can you understand how someone would look at this and say, you know what? They're going after the little guy and ignoring the big multinational corporation with the political connections at the very top that stands to benefit the most here?
Let me assure you that had we the evidence to go after whether it was Halliburton or any other company, we certainly would.
But there was no lack of evidence that Halliburton opposed the U.S. embargo. CEO Dick Cheney went to Calgary to tell oil men it was costing them money.
Sometimes government can get in the way of sound policy. An example of the ineffectiveness of government mandates are U.S. unilateral economic sanctions.
To find out how Cheney and Halliburton got around that problem, you've got to come to a tax haven like the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean. Here's why the Cayman Islands are important to Halliburton. The U.S. embargo against Iran has a loophole, a big one. It is illegal for American companies and American citizens to trade with Iran. But if an American company is registered offshore,